If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. My name is Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and a story editor, and I teach women who are writing in all genres how stories work so they can finish their books faster and without frustration.
And I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I help writers identify and solve their story problems.
On today's episode, Melanie pitched Rebecca so that we can study The Shadow. This 2020 film was directed by Ben Wheatley from a screenplay by Jane Goldman, and it is based, of course, on the novel by Daphne du Maurier. Of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie. And as always, we would love it if you could help other writers find our show by just leaving a rating and review. Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Just go to the show's landing page, scroll to the bottom, click the stars. It is that simple. All right, Melanie, how did you go with Rebecca this week?
Well, it actually was good because I picked it for a very specific reason, and it met my expectations with the study of the shadows. And there were shadows everywhere in this movie. So, which is really interesting because all season I've been repeating the message that the shadow isn't always bad character traits, right? However, this week I chose Rebecca because it will help us look at negative character traits and how they can manifest and drive a person to do terrible things. So what I've been saying all season still rings true, but I'm just showing a different type of shadow and a darker shadow in Rebecca. And I hadn't seen the film before, so but I kind of guessed that it would have lots of shadows, and even I was surprised by how many there were. And they are different, but they're kind of all the same as well, but there's nuances to how they're different and the same. All right, so I'm going to look at Mrs. De Winter, Maxim, Mrs. Danvers, and Rebecca's shadows. But before I do, I just wanted to share the words of a character that I saw in a short series called The Inside Man. And I was watching this with my family during my study this season. And this series has David Tennant in it as a vicar and Stanley Tucci as a man on death row. Now, these 2 characters meet at the end, and then they have a conversation, and then one of them says this to the other, the first character. And I don't want to give anything away. That's why I've kind of made it a bit like a bit anonymous. But so the first character says, "Why me?" And the second one says, "Because I think you might understand, because you and I are the same now." The first one says, "We are not the same." And then the second one says, "Well, of course we are, because everyone is. There are moments that make murderers of us all. We're not freaks in cages to be stared at and judged or written about as though we're a breed apart. We are anyone on a bad day. Cracks open in the most ordinary life and swallow anyone at all. No one is safe from the worst they can do. There are very few advantages of having the blood of a loved one on your hands, but at least you know who you are, who you've always been. The lies are cleared away and you understand him at last, the man behind your eyelids. Terrifying, isn't he?" And I thought that was quite coincidental that while I'm studying The Shadow, there was that bit of a monologue there and a bit of really something that I thought was quite profound and is applicable to my study this week of Rebecca. So when we are talking about crimes and ordinary people committing crimes, we are talking about the shadow being the worst part of human nature. And these are the parts that can start as love and end up as contempt. And they drive us to do terrible things. And there are characters in Rebecca who have been swallowed by the cracks that have opened up in their lives and they can't get out. So it's quite an interesting coincidence that I was watching The Inside Man and studying Rebecca this week. But the most fascinating part of what the character in The Inside Man says when he refers to the lies being cleared away and you understand at last the man behind your eyelids, is that someone who has faced their shadow and is now fully aware of who he is good and bad all rolled into one. And in some ways, they are a more whole person than someone who has not faced their shadow or recognized their shadow. Now, I think that the second Mrs. De Winter, and I'll call her Mrs. De Winter because I think in the novel and in the movies, the main character doesn't have a name, but she's only referred to as Mrs. De Winter. And she is a character who becomes fully aware of who she is and what she is capable of. And I wrote the following notes about my study of the shadow in my study notes this season. This is a note that I made for myself, and I think it's applicable here in the case of Mrs. De Winter. And I wrote, to be a fully integrated character is to understand and know your shadow and to know when to use it and when not to. Now, at the start of the movie, Mrs. De Winter is sweet, naive, timid, and incapable of running her husband's estate. And it's pretty clear that her husband is hiding things from her, including his feelings about the first Mrs. De Winter, Rebecca. Now, the second Mrs. De Winter also struggles to win over Mrs. Danvers, who is very loyal to Rebecca. Mrs. De Winter also struggles to adapt to her new world and appears to be overwhelmed by the ghost of her predecessor. But if we go right back to the beginning of the movie, we see glimpses of Mrs. De Winter's shadow when she's working for Mrs. Van Hopper in Monte Carlo. She has an ability to tell white lies to get her own way, and she can challenge and beat people who appear to have more power than she does. This is her shadow, but it's not fully developed. It's hiding and suppressed, and it only rears its head sometimes. So she hasn't been swallowed by the cracks in her bad day just yet. But her bad day arrives in two ways. The first is via Max, her husband, who reveals that he is fully aware of his shadow. His flashes of anger and his distance and his moodiness are interpreted by Mrs. De Winter as a lingering love for his first wife, but his actions are actually the physical manifestation of his guilt about killing his first wife, Rebecca. Now, I believe that Max is meant to be a sympathetic character when he reveals that he shot his wife. The audience has seen his affection towards Mrs. De Winter, especially at the start of their relationship, and during his confession scene or the she'd made me do it scene, Mrs. De Winter certainly doesn't worry too much about Max's shadow. She sees the whole man and still loves him. And she does this, I think, because he appears to be remorseful. Max is fully aware of his shadow all through the movie, and Mrs. De Winter is suppressing or hiding her shadow right up to the point when it looks like Mrs. Danvers has put Max in jail for killing Rebecca. Then Mrs. De Winter's shadow comes out of hiding. She lies by hiding the truth and creating reasonable doubt and providing a plausible alternate interpretation of the facts around Rebecca's murder. So that is how her shadow comes out, and it links back to that first part of the shadow or those hints of the shadow that we saw at the beginning of the movie. But then there's Mrs. Danvers, and she is all shadow. And I say this because her unexpressed love for Rebecca turned her into a manipulative, cold, and destructive person. She is out for revenge and destruction, and this drives her actions. Danvers is a villain, and what's fascinating about her love for Rebecca is how warped it was. So if Rebecca used everyone around her, found out she was dying, and pushed all of Max's buttons in the worst way, then what sort of person was she? And what sort of person is Danvers who loved her. So Danvers loved Rebecca for her hate and for living her life as she pleased, wreaking a trail of destruction with no consequence. Danvers herself is so contained and so in control that I believe she lived her life vicariously through Rebecca. And the amount of suppression that Danvers must have had to endure because of her station was only compounded when her one and only outlet was taken away. So Danvers is a really interesting character. And then this leaves us with Rebecca. She casts a long and dark shadow over Manderley and everyone who lives there. And that's impressive because she's not on the screen at all. Rebecca is a fantastic antagonist. She brings out the worst in Max, in Danvers, in Frank and Flavel. And it is only Mrs. De Winter who breaks them out of Rebecca's cage. Whether they want to be broken out of it or not is another question, but that's what Mrs. De Winter does. But it does come at a cost. Mrs. De Winter isn't the naive girl from the first part of the movie. She actually becomes an accessory after the fact. So Rebecca is the crack that opened up in the most ordinary lives and swallowed everyone, including her allies, whole. Now, this is going to sound really funny, but when I compare The Incredibles with Rebecca, they have a lot in common. Syndrome, Danvers, and Rebecca are all villains. They are good examples of how the shadow is represented via a villain and how the villain reveals or brings out the worst in the protagonist, or the shadow in the protagonist, or what's suppressed in the protagonist. Mr. Incredible and Mrs. De Winter see their shadows and decide to integrate it into their consciousness. And they stop repressing the hidden parts of their psyche because of their battle with the villains that they face. So this, in my example, Rebecca was a really, really good movie to watch to see different types of shadow and how they evolve throughout a story. So that's what I have about the shadow with Rebecca. Over to you, Valerie, for this week's Heroes Monologue.
All righty. Well, Rebecca is one of those stories that I can appreciate, but I don't know if I love it. Now, I have a little bit of a preamble before I get to the hero's monologue, so stick with me. I will get to the hero's monologue. I read this novel a long time ago. It was published in 1938. And I read it because it's classified as a Gothic novel. And I love Gothic literature. In fact, I have a whole degree in it. But I do remember when I read it, I remember getting tired of all the flower references. That's really the only thing I can remember about the book. The other thing is, I think when I read it many moons ago, I took the book at face value. And now with the experience that I have, life experience and an experience as an author and in studying stories, I think that was a mistake. So the term Gothic covers a whole wide range of genres. This is one of the greatest liabilities we have in this industry, and it's also one of the greatest assets. And by that I mean, having no strict definition of genre is really annoying, but it's also artistically liberating. So today I would probably put Rebecca in the category of psychological thriller because Danvers is messing around with the second Mrs. De Winter's head. I think it's only now that I'm studying the story in detail for this episode, and I'm looking at it in great detail, that I realize that depending on how you look at it, Rebecca either doesn't age well at all, or Daphne du Maurier was way ahead of her time. I think both arguments can be made. I prefer the latter, so that's just what I'm going to go with. And a little fun aside here, just this week I heard an interview with a royal biographer who said that Daphne du Maurier is rumored to have taken as one of her beaux Prince Philip, while he was Prince Philip, while he was married to the Queen. That is a rumor. Anyway, back to the movie. The main character, as you said, Melanie, is known only as the second Mrs. De Winter, and that's true in the novel as well as this film. And I think that is the key to unlocking this whole thing. Now, I'm not a du Maurier scholar, so I can't speak to her body of work or common themes that she explored in her work or whether she was a feminist or not. I don't know anything about that, and I didn't have time to do any research this week. But whether she intended it or not, du Maurier has touched on something that I think is very interesting. She has made a conscious choice not to give her protagonist a name. And I have to say, my dog is here with me and she's snoring, so I hope the microphone is not picking it up. Anyway, I will carry on. Du Maurier made a conscious choice not to give her protagonist a name. So she is known only in relationship to someone else. She is Mrs. Van Hopper's servant, or she is Maxim's wife. And when she's given a name, it's only in reference to her relationship to a man, the second Mrs. De Winter. Now, that is something that we as women are still dealing with today. We are, especially women in middle age, we are someone's mother or daughter or aunt or wife or sister. Even Amal Clooney, with all of her professional experience and accolades, is generally known as George Clooney's wife. And let's not forget, I think it was just a couple of months ago, when Sarah Mullally was named as the Archbishop of Canterbury, Sky News led with this headline: "Woman named as Archbishop of Canterbury in historic first." And then the first paragraph of the story read this way: "The 63-year-old Archbishop designate is married to Iman Mullally, with whom she has 2 children. Originally from Woking in Surrey, she was the UK's chief nursing officer from 1999 to 2004. So Sky News had the headline and the first paragraph of their news story, and they didn't even name Sarah Mullally. And that's in 2025, right? So the church was lauded for appointing a woman, and the woman herself is referenced as a wife and a mother, all before they mentioned her name. Now, they did go back and do a rewrite because they got such backlash from this, and yay for the people who gave them backlash. Go team. But clearly, the author wrote it without thinking about it, and it made it through the editorial staff, and everyone signed off on this before it went live, and nobody noticed that her name wasn't mentioned. So was du Maurier making a comment on this, or at the very least acknowledging that this was common or maybe the status quo in her world? Is that what she was doing in her novel? It's entirely possible. Now, for the sake of argument, let's say that she did do that. That makes the study of the hero's monologue really interesting. So let me quickly recap the theory on this whole hero's monologue thing. So a character, the main character, the protagonist, has an object of desire. And the object of desire is something that she wants so badly, she's going to move heaven and earth to get it. And our jobs as storytellers is to let the audience or the reader know why the character wants this object of desire so badly. So the hero's monologue is all about the why, right? It's explaining to the reader why, the motivation, why the character is doing what she's doing. Why does the character want it so badly? What makes her tick? Why isn't she going to give up on this? Because if there isn't a good reason, when the going gets tough, as it must, if you're going to have a story that works, the main character is going to abandon the thing she's going after. And if she doesn't abandon it, the audience or the reader is going to get really confused and wonder why she isn't giving up, because the whole journey doesn't seem worth the bother, right? That's what will happen. And your reader will just lose interest in your story, close the book, and go on about their life. With Rebecca, we have a couple of interesting things happening. So, first of all, the second Mrs. De Winter is mostly a passive character. In the beginning of the film, she is not actively looking for a husband. The most we know about her is that she needed a job and that she wants to travel. That's why she's working for Mrs. Van Hopper. If Maxim hadn't pursued her, she wouldn't have pursued him. He is the active character, not her. Mrs. Van Hopper is an active character, not her. Mrs. Danvers is active, but not her. We saw the same thing with the holdovers. If you remember, in that episode, I said that even with a passive or mostly passive character, you still need to have a monologue there to let the audience know what motivates the character to behave the way that they do. In Rebecca, there is no hero's monologue. And I watched it a lot. There is no hero's monologue. And I had to really give a lot of thought as to why. Now, it could be that this is weak writing. It's an error on the author's part. Or it could be a deliberate choice by the author. Now, if it's the latter, then perhaps du Maurier realized that the audience wouldn't have to be told why the protagonist accepts Maxim's requests, because it was assumed, or it was general knowledge, or it was the societal norm that every single woman wanted to marry a rich man. Du Maurier didn't explain it because it was understood by everyone that, of course, the protagonist would say yes to Maxim. For her to have rejected his advances would have been so bizarre that her readers wouldn't have bought it. Now, this is also true today, right? I see it with women of all ages all the time. If a handsome man asks you out, it's understood that you're going to say yes. And in fact, he doesn't even have to be very handsome if he's got money. It's just assumed that you would say yes. Saying no is unthinkable. Even today, if a woman says no, she is labeled as difficult, or as being too picky, or as having standards that are too high, or herself being high and mighty. It is inconceivable even today that a woman would say no. Instead, this unnamed protagonist immediately abandons the only thing that she wants, which is to travel and see the world, in favor of being a rich man's wife and spending her whole life in one place, which is Manderley. Now, as it turns out, spoiler alert, Manderley burns down. And so they end up traveling together in search of a new home anyway, but she doesn't know that in the beginning of the movie. She quickly, easily abandons the only thing she says she wants. And all Maxim has to do is give her a second look. That's all he kind of does. He doesn't do much to woo her. He's handsome, he's got a nice car, but he doesn't have to work very hard to get her to say yes. I mean, he brands her in this movie. Did you notice that, Melanie? Maxim brands her. It's the day they go to the beach and she is lying down and he puts sand on her back in the shape of an M so that her entire back will burn except the shape of the M where the sand is. And when she gets back to her hotel room, she looks in the mirror and she's very excited and sort of looks at the back of her shoulder, and we see her skin is all red except for the M that is branded in the back of her shoulder.
I didn't notice that. I noticed that she wasn't burnt there, but I didn't realize it was an M that he'd written.
It's an M.
Wow.
For Maxim. I don't know if that's in the novel. If it's not in the novel, then the filmmakers understood what was happening there.
Yeah.
He has marked her as his possession.
Mm-hmm.
She has no name. She has nothing. She is a possession. I think du Maurier did this purposefully. I really do. Okay, so all of that to say, there is no hero's monologue in Rebecca, and whether it was intentional or not, it does fit in with this whole concept, right? This whole portrayal of an ingenue, in 1938, which, or not even an ingenue, just a woman's role in society, that is still in many ways prevalent today. Not to the extent it was, but we're not there yet. Now, is this something that I think modern writers should attempt? And when I say this, am I recommending that it's to writers that it's okay to not have a hero's monologue in your story? No, I'm not. If you are writing your first book, or even one of your first 5 books, or you're still building a fan base, or you don't yet have a string of New York Times #1 bestsellers, make sure your story has a clear hero's monologue. Don't get cute with this. Don't get fancy. Don't give readers any excuse to put your book down. Give your main character a clear object of desire and explain to them very clearly why they want that thing. That's what the hero's monologue does. Okay, Melanie, what's the action step for today?
All right, the action step is very simple. I want you to think about what differentiates the villain from the other types of shadows that you have in your novel.
And that wraps it up for this episode and for this season. Join us again next week for our Best Advice episode, where we wrap up our lessons learned and aha moments about the hero's monologue and the shadow. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For the power to write a best-selling story, come check out our courses at storynerd.ca/courses. To join my inner circle, go to valeriefrancis.ca/inner-circle. And for tips about books to help you read like a writer, visit Melanie at melaniehill.au. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.